Snow hisses to steam where it lands on blood-warm stone. Osgiliath is burning, and the river carries sparks like dying stars, bumping against bodies that do not sink. From the eastern bank comes the thunder of wheels and the shriek of horses driven too hard, and above it all, a horn blows once, then breaks into a scream. A crown rolls in ash and stops against a severed hand. If you want more Middle-earth that feels one step away from the world you know, give this video a like and subscribe. It helps these stories find their way. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what you think breaks first in Gondor. The first sign was not the banners, it was the smell. In Ithilien, where wet leaves usually held the clean scent of running water, Baranor, son of Calamir, woke before dawn and tasted smoke on his tongue. Not hearth smoke. Not the sweet burn of winter pruning. This was sharper, oily, threaded with horse sweat and dung, and it came from the east as if the wind itself had ridden hard. He stood on the cold earth behind his cottage wall and listened. The woods listened with him. Somewhere a thrush began to sing and stopped mid-note as if it had realized it was singing at the wrong time. His wife, LOTR, came to the door with their youngest on her hip. Her hair was unbound, and in the grey light, her face looked carved from tired stone. "It is early," she said. "It is late," he answered, because he had served as a scout once, and his bones remembered certain mornings on the Dagorlad when the air had turned wrong. Across the river, on the long road that ran between Emin Mool and the Morannon, the Wainriders had begun to move in earnest. They had always been there, in tales told by firelight, in traders' whispers at the quays of Pelagir, in the anxious prayers of soldiers assigned to the old watchtowers. But tales had a way of shrinking things down to fit inside a mind. Wainriders. A single word that could be spoken and then set aside. In truth, they were a nation in motion, clans welded into an army by a hunger that had outgrown the grasslands. Their wagons were not carts, but rolling houses, heavy as small forts, rimmed with iron that had been hammered in distant forges. Their chieftains wore scaled coats taken from dead kings beyond the Sea of Rune. Their bowmen could loose from a moving platform and hit a man's throat at 100 paces. Their horsemen rode with the patience of wolves, circling until a herd broke itself. And now they rode not merely for plunder, but for an ending. In Minas Anor, far west of Baranor's little house and the Duat Woods, Haleth, son of Minadil, ran barefoot across a marble corridor with a roll of parchment clutched in both hands. He was only 17, an underscribe in the Hall of Records, and he had been told that the steward's messenger would wait for no one. The corridor smelled of lamp oil and polished stone. Statues of old kings watched him pass with empty patience. The message came from the eastern marches, written in a captain's cramped hand, sealed with wax that had cracked in the cold. Haleth did not read it. He did not have the right. He only felt the weight of it as if it were a stone pulled from deep water. At the doors of the council chamber, he nearly collided with a man in mail who smelled of wet leather and fear. The soldier steadied Haleth by the shoulder. "Go carefully," the man said, a voice low. "Do not run in these halls. Men trip and die in foolish ways." Haleth looked up and saw that the man's eyes were rimmed red with sleeplessness. A veteran of the garrisons along the Anduin, perhaps. He wanted to ask a dozen questions and asked none, because the corridor itself seemed to demand silence. Beyond those doors, King Anduin sat with his sons at his right hand, and captains and lords gathered like storm clouds around a peak. Maps lay spread on the table, weighted at the corners by small carved stones. The Anduin was a blue vein on parchment, and the eastern bank was marked with red dots where beacons had been lit and then gone dark. Anduin's face was strong, but he had the look of a man who had been watching a horizon for too long. The captain who had brought the message, mud still on his boots, and spoke without ornament. "They are more than last year, Lord, more than any year that living men remember. They have wains without number, and their horses are shod in iron. They have gathered under one banner, a black wheel on a field the colour of old bone. They have crossed the brown lands as if the earth itself were open to them." A lord from Lossarnac snorted as if to dismiss a tale of wild men. "Every generation hears that the Easterlings gather," he said. "Every generation sees them break on our walls." Another voice, older, sharpened by a lifetime at war, answered him. Captain Miriel of Osgiliath was there, one of the few women in the council, her braid tied tight, her cloak still damp from travel. She did not raise her voice, and because of that, men leaned in, every generation. "Yes," she said. "And every generation we spend more coin and more blood to make that true. This time the river is low and the ice is thick. This time our watchtowers are silent." Anduin's elder son, Artemir, looked at the map as though he could stare the ink into changing. "How long?" Anduin asked. The captain swallowed. "Days, Lord, not weeks." Behind the formal words, Haleth heard what was not said. The eastern provinces had already begun to empty themselves of life. Villages abandoned. Granaries fired so the enemy would not eat. Children carried west on carts that creaked under blankets and pots and crying. In Ithilien, the first refugees came that afternoon along the North Road, moving in a line that did not end. Baranor stood by the roadside with other men, passing out what bread and dried meat they could spare. A woman with hands cracked by winter work pressed her face into her shawl and wept without sound as she walked. An old man carried a cage with a single pigeon inside and spoke to it as if it were a son. A boy no older than Baranor's eldest stumbled, and Baranor caught him. "Where are your people?" Baranor asked. The boy stared at him, eyes too wide. "Gone," he said. Then, after a pause that felt like a blade turning, he added, "The wheels ate them." The phrase sounded like madness, but it lodged in Baranor's mind and would not leave. Far to the north, in the wide grasslands of Rovanion, where the wind ran unbroken for leagues, a young Northman named Yol's ancestor, Freywyn, watched smoke rise from a distant settlement and knew without being told that the Wainriders had come there too. His people were riders, free and proud, but even pride bent under iron. His father, grey-bearded and hard-eyed, had gathered the clan under the bare branches of a lone tree. "We can fight," the old man said, "and our bones will feed their dogs. Or we can go north into cold lands and live as strangers until the world turns again." A woman spat into the grass. "And what of the men of stone in the south?" she demanded. "Will they not stand with us?" His father's laugh was like gravel. "The men of stone are busy holding their own river. No one stands with anyone when the wheels begin to roll." In the Shire, where fields lay neat under winter and smoke rose from comfortable chimneys, the name Gondor was nothing but a far-off sound, spoken sometimes by Dunedain, who wandered through, or by the occasional dwarf heading south along the Greenway. Yet even there, in Michel Delving, a hobbit named Burlo Bracegirdle felt unease without knowing why when he found strange tracks near a hedgerow, narrow boot prints, not hobbit feet, and a scuff mark as if something heavy had been dragged. His cousin laughed at him. "Big folk walk through sometimes," she said. "Do not look for shadows under every turnip leaf." Burlo tried to laugh too. He could not. The air had a taste like tin. The first great ending came at the place men would later call the Battle of the Camp, though in this world there would be those who refused to name it at all, as if naming made it real. Ondoher marched east with his sons, and with a host gathered in haste. Standards snapped in a bitter wind. The armourers in Minas Anor worked by torchlight. The city rang with the clatter of hammers, as if it were forging its own heartbeat. Mothers stood on steps holding infants wrapped in wool, and watched fathers walk away without ceremony. The faces of the soldiers were pale, not from fear alone, but from the knowledge that they had been called too late. Miriel returned to Osgiliath to oversee the river defences. Haleth, in Minas Anor, was assigned to copy orders, his hand cramping as he wrote the same names of companies again and again, each line a small sending away. Baranor did not march with the king. He was not called. His war was smaller. He remained in Ithilien to guide refugees west and to burn what could not be carried, and each time he put a torch to a storehouse, he felt as if he were setting fire to his own ribs. On the day the armies met, the sky was the colour of old iron. The ground near the river was frozen hard, and the reeds along the banks stood stiff as spears. The Wainriders came in a long, rippling mass. At their centre rolled the great wains, wheel rims flashing. Their charioteers wore masks of painted wood, faces stretched into smiles that did not reach the eyes. Their horsemen rode out ahead like a curtain of movement, arrows already nocked. Ondoher stood tall among his guard. His sons, Artamir and Faramir, were beside him, cloaks whipping. Ernil, the king's captain, advised caution. He had fought Easterlings before. He had read their feints like a man reads weather. "They want us to break ranks," he said. "They will show us their back and tempt us to chase. Hold." Ondoher's jaw tightened. He did not trust patience. Kings were measured in victories, and the river behind him was not just water, but the boundary of his realm. To yield ground was to admit the East could dictate the shape of Gondor. The first exchange of arrows sounded like hail on rooftops. Gondorian shields rose and shuddered. Men grunted and fell. Horses screamed with the special terror of animals that understand too much. Then the Wainriders withdrew. They did not flee. They flowed backward like a tide that had decided to return to the sea. Their horsemen turned, their chariots wheeled, and their lines opened in a way that looked like disarray. Dust rose. A gap appeared, a promise. The young Prince Artamir leaned forward in his saddle, eyes bright. "They break," he said. A captain near him, Lord Herluin of a lesser house, called out. "Now, while they waver," Ernil's voice cut in. "No, hold the line." Ondoher looked from one to the other. In that glance, a kingdom balanced. He chose motion over restraint. "Forward," he commanded. The Gondorian host advanced, first at a measured pace, then faster as the sight of retreating enemies pricked their blood. The lines stretched. Men began to shout. Discipline thinned like ice under a warming sun. And then the wheels ate them. From either side, hidden behind low rises and scrub, Wainrider horsemen poured in, not in a single wave, but in interlocking arcs. Their arrows struck not at shields, but at horses' eyes, at men's throats, at the gaps beneath arms. The chariots that had seemed to retreat swung around and drove straight into the flanks, their wheels edged with blades that bit into flesh and bone. A Gondorian banner went down, its white cloth darkening as it fell. A prince screamed, not in fear but in rage, and charged into a knot of masked charioteers. He killed 2 before a spear took him beneath the ribs. Artemir died in the mud, with his hands clutching at the shaft as if he could pull it out by will. Faramir, younger, saw his brother fall, and for a heartbeat forgot he was a prince, and became only a boy reaching for family. That was when an arrow took him in the mouth. He fell without a sound, eyes open, a thin line of blood steaming in the cold. Anduin did not see both deaths at once. He was surrounded, striking left and right, his sword ringing against iron. When he turned and saw one son down and the other nowhere, something in his face changed that no chronicler could capture. He fought like a man trying to cut his way through time itself. A masked charioteer drove close, and from the Wain side a hooked blade whipped out and caught the king's helm. It tore the crown from his head as if a hand had plucked it. Anduin's guard surged, but too late. A spear slid under his mail, found the seam, and entered deep. The king sank to his knees. He did not fall face first. He stayed upright for a moment, as if refusing the earth. Ernil tried to reach him. He cut down 2 horsemen, his arm burning from the effort. A third struck his horse, and Ernil went down hard, winded. When he rose, the space where the king had knelt was a knot of bodies and wheels. Someone shouted, "The king is dead!" The words ran along the line faster than any rider. Men turned, men broke, and in the breaking, the Wainriders became not an army, but a scythe. By dusk, the frozen ground was churned to black sludge. The survivors fled toward the river, only to find the crossings already seized by light horsemen who moved like shadows. The Wainriders did not pursue far at first. They stood among the dead, lifting helms, stripping rings, and laughing softly as if they had been given a fine harvest. Ernil escaped by night with a handful of men, bleeding from a cut on his brow. He did not look back. He could not afford to, because behind him lay not merely defeat, but the sudden absence of a center. In Manas Anor, Haleth watched the council chamber erupt into voices when the news arrived. The messenger collapsed halfway through his report. He had run his horse to death. He had not eaten in a day. His lips were cracked and red. "King Anduin," he rasped. "Fallen. Princes. Fallen. The host. Broken." The silence after that felt like a deep pit. Then men began to speak, and what they said revealed more than their words intended. Some demanded immediate vengeance. Some spoke of pulling all forces back behind the Anduin. One lord, pale and sweating, said, "We must sue for terms." Miriel, far away in Osgiliath, did not yet know the king was dead. She felt it, however, when the River Watch towers began to go dark one by one, their signal fires failing, as if an unseen hand snuffed them. In Ithilien, Baranor returned home that night and found his door open. Lothiriel sat on the floor with their youngest in her lap, rocking without sound. The house smelled of smoke, and at first he thought she had lit the hearth too high, but then he saw the scorch marks along the back wall. "They came?" he asked. She nodded once, eyes hollow. "Not soldiers, riders, only a few." They took the goat. They took the blanket my mother made. They asked how many men lived here. How did you answer? I said you were dead, she whispered. I said the plague took you. Baranor looked at his wife with a sudden, fierce gratitude, and then with a dread that was colder than any winter. The riders had not come to steal. They had come to count. The second great ending came with the river. Osgiliath, the old city of stars, straddled the Anduin like a jewel set into flowing silver. Its domes and bridges had once made travelers stop and stare. Now its stones were pocked from years of skirmishes, its beauty worn thin by vigilance. Miriel walked the eastern quay at dawn, listening to the creak of ropes and the low murmur of soldiers. The river smelled sharp and clean, but there was rot under it, something faint and rising. A young soldier leaned on his spear and stared east. "Do you think they will come today?" he asked. "They are already here," Miriel said, and when he looked at her in confusion, she pointed not at the far shore, but at the water itself. The Anduin carried more debris than usual: a broken board, a dead deer, a bundle of reeds tied as if by human hands. It spun slowly in an eddy, and as it turned, the soldier saw an arrow lodged in it, feathers black with pitch. Then the first wain appeared on the eastern bank, not near the usual fords, but farther south, where the reeds grew thick. The Wainriders had not tried to force the great bridges first. They had learned. They were building their own crossings under cover of mist, using the very river's gifts. Miriel barked orders. Archers stepped forward. Fire arrows were brought up, and their tips wrapped in oilcloth. "Light them," she said. The archers loosed. For a moment, the sky filled with small flames, and it was almost beautiful. The arrows fell among reeds and half-built rafts. Some caught. Smoke rose. A cheer began in the throat of the young soldier beside her. Then the mist on the river moved. Not wind, not natural drift. It thickened, rolled, and came forward as if pushed by an unseen wall. The flames dulled inside it, turning red, then dying. From within the white curtain came a sound like many wheels turning on wet wood, and the splash of oars that were not oars, but long poles. "Hold," Miriel said, though her own heart had begun to beat too fast. Shapes emerged, not boats, but flat platforms lashed together, and on them stood bowmen with faces wrapped against the cold. They loosed in unison. The arrows fell among the defenders like a sudden storm. Men cried out. One archer toppled backward off the quay, hands clawing at his neck. Miriel felt the thud of an arrow striking the stone near her foot. Another struck her shoulder, glanced off mail, and left her arm numb with shock. The Wainriders were not merely crossing. They were screening their crossing with death. By midday, the eastern causeway was lost. The defenders fell back to the bridges, hoping to hold the choke points. Miriel ran with them, breath burning in her chest, boots slipping on stone made slick by blood and frost. On the great bridge, a captain raised his sword. "Hold here," he shouted. "For Gondor!" The first wain rolled onto the far end of the bridge, huge and patient, its wheels clanking on stone. It advanced not at speed, but with certainty, more like a siege tower that had learned to move without shame. "Fire!" Miriel screamed. Pitch was poured, torches thrown. Flame blossomed along the bridge's surface. For a moment, it seemed the wain would stop. Then it did something no one expected. It did not stop, and it did not rush. It continued forward, the iron rims cutting through burning pitch, and the wooden sides were clad with damp hides, that steamed and hissed but did not catch. Behind it, in its wake, came horsemen riding straight into fire, because the Wainriders had decided that bridges were not sacred. The captain who had shouted for Gondor vanished under the leading wheel with a sound like a crushed gourd. Miriel saw that, and she knew the bridge was lost. She turned and grabbed the young soldier by the collar. "Go," she said. "Run to the western gate. Tell them to seal it. Do not stop for anyone." "What about you?" he cried, eyes wild. Miriel looked back at the advancing Wain, at the masked men behind it, at the arrows that darkened the air. She felt in her bones the weight of all the years Gondor had leaned on this river as if it were a wall. "I will slow them," she said. "That is my work." She did not die in a heroic blaze that songs could carry. She died in smoke and confusion, on a stairwell slick with blood, stabbed by a boy with shaking hands who wore Wainrider leather and did not look at her face. Her last sight was a crack in the stone wall where a small weed had grown, green against grey, trembling in the heat. Osgiliath fell by evening. The western half held for one more night, then burned when the defenders withdrew and set fire to their own stores. The river reflected the flames, and for miles the sky glowed as if dawn had arrived early and wrong. In Minas Anor, Haleth stood with other scribes on the high wall and watched the far horizon redden. "It is Osgiliath," murmured an old man beside him. The old man had copied treaties and laws for 60 years. His hand shook now. "It is the city of the kings." Haleth swallowed. "Will they come here next?" The old man did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was almost too quiet to hear. "Where else is there to come?" In Ithilien, Baranor gathered his family that night and made a choice that felt like betrayal. He loaded a cart with what little they could carry: blankets, dried food, a few pots, his father's knife. He went to the hearth and took a coal in a clay jar, because even in flight, a man carried fire. LOTR wrapped the children in wool. The eldest, a girl of 9, each stared at the house as if she could memorize it. "Will we come back?" she asked. Baranor opened his mouth, and for a moment he could not speak. What promise could he make that the world would not mock? "Yes," he said finally, because children needed a word to hold on to even when it broke later. They joined the stream of refugees moving west, and as they climbed a rise, Baranor looked back and saw through the trees a thin line of smoke rising from his roof. Someone had entered after they left. Someone had set a torch. The third great ending began in a place that still believed itself far away. In Arda, in the north, King Arda sat in a hall that smelled of pine and old smoke, listening to a messenger who had ridden hard from the south. Outside, snow felt soft and steady, muffling the world. Inside, the fire crackled. And men wore furs instead of mail, because winter there was a different kind of enemy. The messenger knelt, cheeks raw from cold. "Gondor is broken east of the river," he said. "King Anduin is dead. Osgiliath burns. Minas Ithil is threatened." A murmur ran through the hall. Some men cursed. Some crossed themselves in the old Númenórean fashion. Arda's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. Gondor had been the southern arm of the same ancient body, the other kingdom of the Dunedain. When Gondor bled, the north felt it, even through 1,000 miles of wilderness. Arda turned to Malbeth the seer, who stood near the fire like a shadow that had learned to speak. "What do you see?" Arda asked. Malbeth's eyes were pale and distant. "A road," he said, "and on it a wheel. It rolls north as well as south. Men will say, 'We are not Gondor, we are safe.' And they will be wrong." A captain scoffed. "The Wainriders are far. Angmar is our foe." Malbeth's gaze shifted to him. "Foes learn from one another," he said. "And when one kingdom falls, who will come to aid the other?" Arvedwash understood then what the messenger had truly brought. Not merely news, but a narrowing of the world. There would be no southern help if Angmar struck again. There would be no great host to answer a northern call. The last alliance of men, such as it was, had been a thread, and a thread had been cut. He made a decision that would kill him. "We will strike Angmar before it strikes us," Arvedui said. "We will not sit and wait for darkness to choose its hour." His counsellors argued. Some begged caution. Some spoke of strengthening the weather hills, of sending for aid from Linden. But Arveduis' pride, like Ondoher's, chose movement over restraint. He sent riders to summon levies. He sent messengers to the elves, asking for what help they could spare. In the Shire, Burlo Bracegirdle saw strangers on the greenway, tall men in dark cloaks, moving quickly, faces hidden. Rangers, perhaps, though Burlo did not know the word. One of them stopped at the hedge and looked south, as if listening to something beyond hearing. Burlo, curiosity overcoming his unease, stepped closer. "Is there trouble?" he asked, because hobbits asked questions the way they ate meals, often and with hope of comfort. The tall man's face was weathered, his eyes grey and tired. "There is always trouble," the ranger said. Then, seeing Berlos' confusion, he softened his tone. "Keep your doors barred at night, and if a man with a strange accent asks the way to the Brandywine, tell him nothing." "Why?" Burlo asked. The question came out small. The ranger hesitated, as if weighing how much truth a hobbit could carry without breaking. "Because the world's walls are thinner than they look," he said at last, and he walked on. That winter, Angmar moved. Witch King's forces had been probing for years, but now they came with a new confidence, as if they had smelled southern blood. Orcs poured through mountain passes. Hillmen gathered in greater numbers. Wolves came down in packs, bold enough to take livestock from fenced fields. Arvedui rode out with his host under a sky that promised more snow. His banner, the 7 stars, snapped in the wind. Men sang to keep fear from their throats. On a ridge near Amon Sul, they met an army that seemed too large to have gathered so quickly. Arveduis' captain muttered, "They have been waiting." The first clash was brutal. Steel rang, snow turned pink. Arvedui fought at the front because he believed kings should be seen. He cut down an orc and a hillman, and for a moment it seemed his boldness might pay. Then a horn sounded from behind their line, not from Arthedain, from the north. Arvedui turned in his saddle and saw riders cresting a distant rise. Not Angmar's hillmen, but men in strange armour, with long spears and small round shields, their horses lean and fast. Their banner bore a black wheel. The Wainriders had sent a detachment north, not to conquer outright, but to close the trap. They struck Arthedain's rear while Angmar held the front, and in that moment, Arvedui understood too late that darkness had learned to cooperate. "Fall back!" he shouted. "To the hills!" But the snow, which had been merely weather, became an enemy. Men slipped, horses panicked, the line buckled. Arveduis' horse took an arrow and went down. The king hit the ground hard, breath driven from him. He rose with snow in his beard and drew his sword, a thin line of steel against a world gone mad. A Wainrider spearman rode at him. Arda parried, the impact jolting his arm. He struck back and cut the man's leg, and the spearman fell, screaming. Arda turned to find another spear already coming. His guard tried to reach him. They were too far, bogged in bodies and snow. A hillman grabbed Arda's cloak, and Arda spun and killed him. The second spear took him under the arm. Arda gasped, staggered, and fell to his knees. For a moment, he was very still, as if listening. Then he looked up at the grey sky and said, "To no one and everyone. Is this how the line ends?" No answer came. Snow fell on his eyelashes. His sword slipped from his hand and vanished into white. In that world, there would be no long-hidden heir raised in the wild, no steady ranger chieftain to gather broken hopes. The North would not die in one day, but it would lose its spine, and the Shire would become less a forgotten garden and more a place standing unguarded beside a road. When word of Arda's death reached Lindon, an elf lord stared west toward the sea and said softly, "The dominion of men diminishes." He did not weep. Elves had seen too much to spend tears easily. Yet in the pause before he turned away, there was a silence that held mourning like a jewel held in a closed fist. The fourth great ending rose from the moon tower. Minas Ithil, the tower of the moon, stood white and beautiful above the vale, watching the Morgul Road and the Ethel Duath. Its stones caught starlight and returned it. In the gardens, silver flowers grew that had been brought from Numenor long ago, stubborn against time. Now its beauty became a target. After Osgiliath fell, the Wainriders did not rush at Minas Anor first. They turned their full attention to Minas Ithil, because whoever held that tower held the eastern door of Gondor. And in its highest chamber sat a seeing stone, the Ithil Palantir, a treasure older than the kingdom itself. The commander of Minas Ithil, Lord Caladir, walked the battlements at night while snow drifted through torchlight. His men looked east and saw fires scattered across the plain like a fallen constellation. They heard drums, low and patient, beating in patterns that did not belong to Gondor. A young officer approached Caladir, breath steaming. "Lord," he said, "we should send the stone away." Caladir's face tightened. "To Minas Anor? Yes, or to Osgiliath." "Osgiliath is ash," Caladir said, and the words tasted like bitterness. "And Minas Anor is crowded with panic. If we send the stone now, it will travel with fear, and fear is a beacon. What will you do then?" Caladir looked up at the moon, pale behind cloud. "I will keep it," he said, because pride could sound like duty when spoken in a low voice. In Minas Anor, Haleth copied orders that never reached their recipients because messengers were cut down on the roads. The city filled with refugees. The markets smelled of sweat, wet wool, and desperation. Men argued over bread. Children cried until they had no voice left. In the lower circles, a rumor took root like a weed. The lords were hiding food. The palace was safe while common folk starved. It was not entirely true, but hunger did not require truth to become angry. Haleth's mother, a laundress, came home with raw hands and said, "They say the king's bloodline is ended. They say there will be no king." Haleth tried to sound steady. "There will be a council. They will choose." "Choose," she echoed and laughed without humor. "They choose, and we wait. We always wait." At Minas Ithil, the siege began with silence. The Wainriders did not storm the walls at once. They encircled the city and built earthworks. They brought their wains close and lashed them together into moving barricades. They cut down trees and made ramps. They set up great bows that could cast stones wrapped in burning pitch. The first stone struck the outer garden, shattering a marble fountain. Water sprayed and froze in midair, and turning into a glittering cloud that fell like glass. Caladir watched the garden burn, and something in him broke, because that garden had been a memory of the West made stone and leaf. He turned to his captain. "How long?" he asked. "Weeks, if they do not breach," the captain said. "Days, if they do." Caladir went to the chamber of the Seeing Stone that night and stood before it alone. The Palantir sat on its stand like a dark eye. He had been warned not to use it without need. He had heard tales of minds lost in its depths, of men who stared too long and came away hollow. He placed both hands on the cold surface. At first, he saw only darkness. Then, slowly, an image formed. A wide plain under a red sunrise, wains rolling, banners snapping. He saw the face of a Wainrider chieftain, close enough to count scars. The chieftain's eyes lifted. Damned for a heartbeat, it seemed he looked directly into Caladir's mind. Caladir flinched back, heart pounding. He told himself it was only a trick of imagination. Yet, as he stepped away, he felt as if he had been noticed. The next day, the Wainriders brought forward a prisoner, a Gondorian soldier captured in the ruins of Osgiliath. They tied him to a post within sight of the walls. A masked herald rode forward and called in broken Westron. "Give us the moon tower, and we will spare those who kneel." The soldier at the post lifted his head. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut. He spat blood and shouted, "Go back to the east." The Wainriders did not kill him quickly. They set fire to the post's base and let the flames climb. His screams carried to the walls, and men there wept with helpless rage. Caladir's jaw clenched until it hurt. "Loose arrows," he commanded. Archers shot, but the distance was too great, the wind wrong. The arrows fell short, useless as prayers spoken into a storm. That night, a betrayal opened the gate. It was not a grand treachery of lords and crowns. It was a small man, a gatekeeper, whose wife had been taken when the outer villages fell. The Wainriders had promised her return, and in his hunger for that promise, he unbarred a postern door while the watch was thin. Wainrider scouts slipped in like smoke. By dawn, the fighting was in the streets. The white stones ran red. Caladir fought in the lower court, his sword slick, his breath ragged. He saw his captain go down under a spear. He saw a boy in Gondorian livery stabbed and then trampled. The sounds were too many. Steel on steel, men shouting names, horses screaming as they slipped on blood. Caladir was driven back step by step toward the tower's heart. He thought, briefly, of destroying the Seeing Stone, of casting it from the high window onto the rocks below. But the Palantir was not so easily broken, and time was not a thing granted freely in a siege. In the chamber, he found 2 of his own men already there, eyes wide. "They are coming," one whispered. Caladir heard footsteps in the stairwell, heavy and assured. Wainrider voices spoke in their own tongue, laughing. Caladir placed his hands on the Palantir again, not to see the enemy, but to send one last warning to Minas Anor. He thought of the other stone there, the Anor stone, and tried to reach it like a man calling across a stormy sea. For a moment, he felt a connection, a distant awareness, like a light behind closed doors. He saw, in a flash, the white tower of Minas Anor, its courts crowded with people. He saw Haleth, not by name, but by presence, standing among scribes. He saw the white tree in the court of the fountain, its leaves trembling in a wind that did not touch the rest of the city. Then another will enter the vision, sudden as a knife in the dark. Not a Wainrider, not a man at all, though it wore a man's shape. A shadow crowned with fear, a thought that had slept and now stirred because the world had opened a door. Caladir jerked back, gasping, as if cold water had been thrown into his lungs. The chamber's torches flickered. The air smelled briefly of something ancient and foul, like old graves. The Wainriders burst in. Their chieftain, the one Caladir had seen, stepped forward. He was tall, his beard braided with bone beads. He looked at the palantir with a kind of reverence. "Pretty stone," he said, in Westron that was surprisingly clear. The South King kept toys. Caladir raised his sword. "It is not yours." The chieftain smiled. "Everything rolls," he said, "even kingdoms. They did not kill Caladir at once. They bound him and made him watch as they carried the palantir away wrapped in cloth like a stolen child. When they finally slew him, it was outside in the cold, with no witness but falling snow. Minas Ithil became a fortress of the Wainriders for a brief time, and then something else claimed it. Because some victories are bait. Years passed like water running under ice. Gondor did not fall in a single night, not fully. It recoiled, bleeding, hardening. Minas Anor remained, and behind its walls people tried to keep living, baking bread, burying dead, marrying, fighting over taxes, singing songs at midwinter, as if songs could nail the roof beams back onto the world. Yet the East was gone. Ithilien became a land of ruins, where smoke rose from abandoned hearths. The Anduin became not a boundary, but a wound. Raiders crossed in boats at night, burning farms in Anorian. The Wainriders planted settlements on the eastern bank and called it theirs with the casual certainty of conquerors. Baranor and his family reached Minas Anor with the last great wave of refugees. They entered through the gate under the watchful eyes of guards who looked at every newcomer as if measuring how much hunger they would add. Inside, the city smelled of too many bodies packed too close, of dung and wet wool and stew stretched thin. They found space in a crowded storehouse where families lay shoulder to shoulder. At night, Baranor listened to coughs and whispered prayers. Lothiriel, holding their children close, asked him in the dark, "Did we do right?" Baranor stared at the ceiling beams. "We did what we could," he said, but he did not believe the words fully. In the councils of Gondor, a new power grew. The stewards, men whose duty had been to manage the realm for kings, now managing because kings were dead, and the claimants argued like ravens over carrion. Ernil, who had survived the Battle of the Camp, returned to Minas Anor and demanded the crown by right of strength, and many supported him because men needed a figure to stand behind. But there were others. A lord from Pelagia spoke of building a new center on the sea, away from the river's curse. Another argued that Gondor should abandon Minas Anor and retreat to the southern fiefs. The debates were not noble. They were desperate. Haleth, older now, watched these men and learned that the fall of cities began not only with armies, but with voices that could not agree on what home meant. Ernil did become king in this world, but he became a king of a shrinking realm, his crown heavy with loss. He sent envoys to the north, seeking alliance with Arthedain, and found only silence and snow. He sent riders to Rovanion, seeking the Northmen's aid, and found that the Northmen were fleeing like hunted deer, driven into colder lands. And in the east, the Palantir taken from Minas Ithil passed from Wainrider hands to something that made even the Wainriders uneasy. It began with dreams. The chieftain who had taken the stone, Ulfang Wheelmaster, slept in the high chamber of Minas Ithil and woke sweating, and his heart racing as if he had run. He dreamed of a lidless eye and a voice that spoke without words. He dreamed of a tower rising from ash, black against a red sky. His shamans burned herbs and muttered charms. They told him the stone was powerful, a gift from the gods of the West. They told him he was chosen. Ulfang believed them because belief was easier than admitting fear. Then the riders who guarded the eastern road began to vanish. They were not found dead. They were not found at all. Their horses returned riderless, eyes rolling, foam on their bits. Men whispered of a shadow moving at night, a coldness that made torches dim. One evening, as Ulfang sat with his war captains in the hall of Minas Ithil, the doors opened without a hand on them. The torches guttered. A chill rolled in that did not belong to winter. A figure entered, cloaked and hooded, and where it stepped, the air seemed to thin. The men at the table fell silent because their bodies understood danger before their minds could name it. Ulfang rose, forcing himself to stand tall. "Who are you?" he demanded. The figure did not answer in the manner of men. It spoke, and the voice was like wind over tombstones. "You have taken what was mine," it said. Ulfang's throat tightened. "This is my city," he said, and even as he spoke, he heard the lie in it. The figure lifted a hand, and for an instant the room darkened as if a cloud had passed over the moon. Ulfang's captains flinched, some dropping their cups. One man whimpered, and hatred flared in Ulfang, because his own men were afraid in front of a stranger. "What do you want?" Ulfang asked, voice rough. The figure's hood tilted slightly, as if listening to a far-off sound. "A gate," it said, "a place from which to reach." Ulfang swallowed. "We have gates, we have roads. Speak plain." The figure's voice did not change, but the air grew colder. "You have a stone that sees," it said. "You have built walls where walls should not stand. Give me the tower, and you will have kingdoms. Refuse, and your bones will not even be remembered by wolves." Ulfang had killed men without counting. He had watched cities burn and felt only satisfaction. Now he felt something new, the certainty that his own strength meant nothing here. He tried to bargain anyway, because chieftains bargained even with storms. "Half," he said. "Half the tower, half the spoils." The figure moved, and suddenly it stood beside the table, though no one had seen it cross the space. Ulfang's breath caught. In the darkness beneath the hood, there was nothing a man could look at, and yet he felt looked through. "Do you think you are negotiating?" the voice asked softly. Ulfang's pride shattered into obedience. "Take it," he whispered. "Take the tower." The figure inclined its head. "Wise," it said, and withdrew as silently as it had come. When it was gone, the room remained cold. Ulfang sat down slowly, as if his bones had aged. One captain, trembling with rage and shame, spat and said, "What was that?" Ulfang stared at the place where the figure had stood. "The reason we won," he said, and did not explain, because he could not. So Minas Ithil changed hands again, not by siege, but by surrender to a terror older than any wagon wheel. The Nazgul did not yet have names in Gondor, not fully. They were remembered dimly in old Númenórean records as ringwraiths, the servants of the enemy long thought fled or hidden. Yet now they returned sooner, drawn by the Seeing Stone's awakening, by the widening crack in the world's defences. Minas Ithil became Minas Morgul a generation earlier than it should have, and the veil around it sickened. The silver flowers in the gardens blackened and crumbled. The air took on a sour stink, like water gone stagnant. Men who camped within sight of the walls woke screaming, clutching their throats, convinced a hand had been there. When Eärnil heard, he grew pale and silent. He had believed he fought men. He had believed the world's old horrors were sleeping behind locked doors. "How many?" he asked his captain. The captain's voice shook. "9, Lord. They say there are 9. Eärnil looked at the white tower of Minas Anor, then beyond it, as if he could see the land that was now lost. "What hope do we have?" he murmured, not as a rhetorical flourish, but as a genuine question that tasted like ash. Yet, even in despair, men kept moving, because stillness meant death. Eärnil gathered what strength he could and attempted a counterstroke at the crossings. For a brief season, hope rose like a fragile flame. Gondor's ships on the river, armed with archers, ambushed Wainrider raiding parties. A force from Pelagia marched north and retook a ruined fort. Baranor, now pressed into service as a guide, led a company through woods he had once called home, and the scent of familiar earth made him almost weep. In that season, Haleth stood again on the wall and saw not fire on the horizon, but clear sky. He allowed himself, for the first time in years, to imagine that the worst had passed. Then Minas Morgul opened its gates. The first sortie was not an army, but a whisper made visible. Riders came out under a pale moon, cloaks trailing like smoke. Their horses were not living horses, or if they were, they had forgotten what life felt like. Frost formed on stone where they passed. A Gondorian outpost near the river sent a runner back with eyes wild. He collapsed at the guardhouse and babbled of a cold that had entered his bones and would not leave, of a voice that promised him his mother's scream. Eärnil rode to the outpost himself, furious at talk of ghosts. He arrived to find men sitting with their backs against the wall, staring at nothing. "What happened?" he demanded. A sergeant lifted his head slowly. His face was grey. "They came," he said. "We could not see them. We could only feel them. And then we ran." Eärnil looked at the river. Mist lay on it, thick and unnatural. In that mist, a shape moved, tall and thin. Eärnil drew his sword. "Show yourself," he shouted. A laugh answered him, not loud, but close enough to make his skin crawl. Then a cold pressure touched Eärnil's mind, and for a heartbeat he saw his own death, himself on a field, alone, his crown a mockery, his people gone. The vision was so intimate it felt like memory. He staggered. His captain caught his arm. "Lord!" the captain cried. Eärnil wrenched free, ashamed. He tried to stand tall, but his men had seen the moment's weakness, and fear spread like spilled oil. A black blade flashed in the mist. Eärnil's horse screamed and reared. Eärnil fell, struck his head on stone, and lay stunned. The Nazgul did not kill him there. Now they did something worse. They let him live with the knowledge that he could be reached. When he returned to Minas Anor, his hair seemed suddenly greyer. He began to trust fewer men. He began to sleep less. In council, he snapped at advisors and accused loyal lords of treachery. The betrayal that followed was not by a villain with a twisted smile. It was by exhausted men who wanted an end. A southern lord, fearing that Minas Anor would draw the storm down upon all Gondor, began secret talks with Umbar. Corsair captains, always eager to profit from Gondor's weakness, offered ships and aid in exchange for autonomy and tribute. The lord agreed, telling himself it was necessary. Harleth discovered the correspondence by accident while copying tax records. The seal on one letter was wrong for any Gondorian house, and curiosity, that small, honest vice, made him hold it up to the light. He saw the faint indentation of a foreign mark. He took it to his superior, expecting outrage and swift justice. His superior read it, then closed his eyes as if in pain. "You did not see this," the man said quietly. Harleth stared. "It is treason. It is survival," the man replied, and the words were not cruel. They were weary. "Do you think we can fight Easterlings, Wraiths, and Corsairs all at once? Choose which knife you will accept and call it a belt." Harleth felt his stomach twist. "If we accept knives," he said, voice shaking, "what remains of us?" The man looked at him with something like pity. "A city," he said. "Perhaps." Harleth walked out of the records hall and into the court of the fountain where the white tree stood. It was older now, its bark cracked, its leaves fewer. Now he placed his hand on the cold stone rim and stared at the tree as if it might answer. Could a kingdom bargain away its soul and still call itself alive? In the Shire, Burlo Bracegirdle's unease became real the day a band of strange men came to Bywater asking for directions to the old forest. Their accents were thick. Their clothes were travel-worn. One wore a small wheel emblem stitched inside his cloak where he thought no one would see. A hobbit child pointed and laughed at them because hobbit children had not yet learned the price of laughter. The men did not laugh back. They bought beer, paid too much, and left. That night, a barn burned on the edge of the village. The flames were small, almost polite, but the message was clear. The world could reach even here. Seasons turned into decades, and in those decades, Gondor became a different thing. It did not vanish. Minas Anor held, its walls tall, its people stubborn. But it ceased to be the proud eastern bulwark of the west. It became a fortress city clinging to the last safe heights, a place where children learned the sound of distant drums before they learned the names of flowers. Calenardon, the wide green lands that would have become Rohan, did not become a gift to riders from the north. There was no strength, no surplus, no confidence to grant. The Northmen, driven hard, either bent their necks to new masters in the east or fled so far into cold that their songs changed. There would be no horse lords thundering to the rescue in some future siege. The great fields lay empty, haunted by wolves and by memories that had no one left to remember them. In Minas Anor, now the line of kings faltered and broke. Ernil died not in battle, but in his bed, eyes open, refusing to close even in death, as if he feared what he would see. His son, Eärnur, grew to manhood in a city that felt like a trap. In another world, he would have ridden to challenge the Witch King. In this one, he never reached that moment. One night, Eärnur climbed the tower and looked east. He saw a sickly green glow rising from Minas Morgul, steady as a heartbeat. He heard, faintly, a horn that was not a horn, a call that seemed to speak his name, though no sound could travel that far. Haleth, now chief among scribes, found the young king there. "Lord," Haleth said gently, "you should not stand alone." Eärnur did not turn. "Do you know what it is to be king of a lesser kingdom?" he asked. Haleth hesitated. "No, Lord. It is to inherit a wall," Eärnur said. "Not a realm, not a people, a wall." Haleth chose his words carefully. "Walls can hold," he said, "if men stand upon them." Eärnur finally looked at him. His eyes were bloodshot with sleeplessness. "And when men stop standing," he asked, "when they begin to dream of quieter lives under foreign rule? When they whisper that the stewards manage better than kings? What then?" Haleth felt the chill of that question because he had heard the whispers. "The king must give them something to stand for," Haleth said. Eärnur's laugh was short. "Stand for what?" he asked. "A tree that is dying? A stone that was stolen? A river we no longer own?" In that moment, Haleth understood that Eärnur was already half vanished, drawn eastward by despair as surely as by any wraith's lure. Eärnur disappeared soon after, not riding proudly with banners, but slipping out with a small escort one foggy morning, driven by a need to prove he was more than a caretaker of ruins. He rode toward Minas Morgul and was never seen again. When the gates of Minas Anor closed that night, the people waited for their king's return until waiting became absurd, then painful, then quietly shameful. The stewards took full power, and this time there was no pretense that it was temporary. The chair of the king sat empty and gathered dust. The crown was locked away like an embarrassment. In the far south, Umbar grew rich. In the east, the Wainriders fractured and reformed under darker banners, some becoming servants of the shadow that now openly stirred. In the north, the remnants of Arthedain scattered, and the rangers who might have guarded the Shire became fewer, and their line broken by Arvaduis' early death and by battles that found them without allies. And still, the ring lay hidden, moving from hand to hand by strange mercy, because some threads of fate did not snap simply because kingdoms did. Centuries later, long after Haleth and Baranor were dust and bone, the Shire remained, smaller in spirit, more cautious. Hobbits locked their doors at night. They learned to watch the road. Tales of black riders were not merely fireside nonsense. They were warnings children absorbed with their porridge. When Bilbo Baggins found a ring in a dark cave, the world did not tremble outwardly at once, but something in the east turned its lidless attention, searching. Sauron's return did not require Gondor's strength to be delayed. With Minas Morgul established early and the Ithilstone taken, the Dark Lord's reach into minds was sharper. Men in Minas Tirith, as it was now called by those who still clung to old pride, dreamed of an eye more often than they dreamed of summer. Gandalf came to the Shire and found not the carefree land he had once loved in another telling of the world, but a land with quiet patrols and hidden storehouses, a land that had learned scarcity. He sat in Bag End with Frodo Baggins, and the firelight made the room feel temporarily safe. Frodo listened as Gandalf spoke of the ring's danger, and when Gandalf finished, Frodo's face had gone pale. In the stories, Frodo said slowly, Gondor always stands. There is always a great city, a great king, an army in shining mail. Where are they? Gandalf's eyes were heavy with long knowledge. They are tired, he said, and they are fewer than they should have been. Then what can we do? Frodo asked, and the question was not rhetorical. It was the voice of an ordinary person staring at a storm that had swallowed towers. Gandalf leaned forward. "Walk," he said. "Carry it away from here. Because if you do nothing, the shadow will come to your door and there will be no wall between." The fellowship that formed was smaller, more desperate. Aragorn was not there, because there was no Aragorn. There were rangers still, but no single heir carrying the weight of Isildur's line like a hidden sword. The men who came were brave, but they did not carry destiny in their blood. They carried only choice. Boromir, a captain of the Steward's Guard in Minas Tirith, did come, but he came from a city already half-starved and ringed by fear. His pride was sharper, his hope more brittle, because he had grown up under walls that shook at night with distant screams from the east. When the fellowship reached Lorien, Galadriel looked into their hearts and saw not only the ring's burden, but the altered shape of the world behind them. A Gondor that had been wounded earlier, a north that had been broken, a Rohan that had never been born. Her face remained serene, but there was an ancient sorrow in her eyes. At the mirror, Frodo saw Minas Morgul and shuddered, because in his vision it was older, deeper, more entrenched, its green glow like a poison that had soaked into the land over centuries. He saw Minas Tirith, white still, but with fewer lights in its windows, a city saving lamp oil. He saw briefly a tree in a courtyard, bare branches clawing at winter sky. "Is there any path that ends well?" he whispered. Galadriel's voice was soft. "Some paths end," she said. "Well is not promised." The War of the Ring came, and it came like a wave breaking over a ship already damaged. Without Rohan, the West had no sudden thunder of hooves to answer despair. The Rohirrim charge that would have been sung of did not exist. Instead, small bands of riders from scattered Northman clans arrived in ones and twos, lean and exhausted, bringing news that the eastern plains were filled with marching feet, that black banners moved like a forest. Minas Tirith endured siege, but it was a siege of a different character. Not a proud city resisting with confidence, but a weary fortress clinging to breath. The Pelennor fields, less cultivated, more scarred, filled with smoke and the stench of old burnings. In the city, a healer named Ioreth, older now, moved among the wounded and smelled the familiar mix of blood and stale fear. She muttered prayers over men who stared at the ceiling as if they had already left their bodies. Outside, catapults thudded, and the stone walls shook like a living thing trying not to scream. The steward, Denethor, stood in the tower and used the Anor Stone, because in this world the temptation to look was greater, the need sharper. He saw too much. He saw the vastness of the enemy, and he saw no king coming with a sword reforged from legend. The city held longer than it had any right to, because men can endure astonishing pain when they believe their children might live. But there was a moment when the first gate broke, when iron screamed and splintered wood flew, and the defenders felt the old certainty that this was how Osgiliath had ended, how Minas Ithil had ended, how everything ended. And then, far away, in a land of ash and fire, relief arrived like a breath taken after near drowning. Frodo and Sam, two small figures on a slope of slag, reached the cracks of doom in a world that had been made harsher by earlier darkness. The air burned their lungs. The sky was a bruise. Behind them, armies moved like insects. Ahead, the mountain's mouth glowed red. Frodo crawled, fingers raw. Sam hauled him when he could not move. No songs played, no banners flew, only the sound of their breath and the distant roar of a land that wanted them dead. At the edge, Frodo stood, swaying. The ring hung on its chain like a weight of history. He did not throw it in at once. He hesitated, because the ring was not only power, it was relief. It whispered that he could stop being small, stop being afraid, stop being helpless in a world where walls fell and kings died and ordinary people burned. "I have come," he said, voice thin. "But I do not choose this." In that instant, all the watching malice in Middle-earth seemed to turn toward that small ledge. Then Gollum came, as he always did, because some tragedies are stubborn. He fought like a starving creature. He bit, clawed, wept. He took the ring and danced on the brink in mad joy, and in that joy he slipped and fell, and the ring went with him into fire. The relief that followed was immediate, physical, like a sudden loosening of a hand around the throat of the world. In Minas Tirith, defenders on the wall felt a pressure lift, and some fell to their knees without knowing why, sobbing in confusion. In Mordor, the air seemed to shatter. Shadows reeled. The great darkness that had grown fat on centuries of fear screamed without sound and collapsed inward like a tower of smoke in a sudden wind. On the Pelennor, a soldier looked up and saw for the first time in his life a patch of blue sky where smoke had been, and he laughed like a man who had forgotten laughter existed. For a little while, there was peace. Then the disquiet began to seep in, as cold returns after the brief warmth of a fire's flare, because the ring's destruction did not restore what had been lost early. It did not unburn Osgiliath. It did not replant Ithilien's gardens. It did not resurrect Arvedui or undo the broken lineage that might have given the West a unifying king. It did not conjure a Rohan that never existed. It did not erase the bargains made with knives. The armies of the East, leaderless, did not vanish. They scattered, and scattered enemies became bandits, warlords, petty tyrants. Gondor's borders were not suddenly safe. They were suddenly undefined. The stewards remained in power because there was no clear claimant and no appetite for new civil war. The empty king's chair stayed empty. In the Shire, hobbits returned to their holes and tried to pretend the world had not brushed their door. Frodo did not pretend. He walked under the trees and felt the wind and knew that victory could still leave wounds that did not heal. Samwise Gamgee married and planted gardens, stubborn as hope. He brought soil from Lorien, as in the old telling, and it did make flowers grow where smoke had once curled. Children laughed again in Hobbiton, and laughter mattered, because it was life asserting itself. In Minas Tirith, the Ioreth tended the wounded and watched the white tree, which had been ailing for generations, put forth a new leaf after the shadows fall. The leaf was small, almost absurd against the great city's stone. Yet it was green, and that green struck some watchers harder than any sword. Denethor did not die in fire in this world. He lived, and living was its own punishment. He walked the courts and saw the hollow spaces where kings should have been, where alliances should have stood. He saw the faces of men who had survived, only to realize there was no grand restoration waiting, only the slow work of rebuilding with fewer hands. One evening, an old man sat on the wall of Minas Tirith and watched the sunset over the distant mountains. His grandson asked, "Is it over?" The old man thought of Osgiliath burning in his father's stories. He thought of Minas Morgul's, green glow fading but not forgotten. He thought of all the fields that had grown wild because no one had time for harvest when survival was the daily crop. "It is over," he said, and after a long pause he added, "But it is not undone. Far to the east, in the ruined shell of Minas Morgul, the walls stood silent. The sickly light was gone. The air no longer made men gag, though it still smelled faintly of stone that had been soaked in sorrow. A young soldier from Gondor, part of a cautious expedition, walked through the empty courts. His boots crunched on shattered glass and old bone. He held a torch, and the flame's small crackles sounded too loud. In a high chamber, he found markings on the wall, scratches made by a blade, perhaps, or by nails. He leaned close and saw that they formed a circle, a wheel shape, over and over, as if someone had been trying to remember an emblem or trying to prove a truth with repetition. He shivered and backed away. Outside, the moon rose, pale and steady, shining on broken towers and on the Anduin far off, still flowing, still indifferent. The soldier looked west toward home, and for a heartbeat, he felt comfort. Then, from deep within the ruin, something small moved in the dark. Not a wraith and not a man, only a shadow of memory where fear had lived too long, and the torchlight trembled as if the stone itself exhaled. The river carried on, and in its black water the reflection of a wheel turned slowly, though nothing above it moved.